Well, friends, I'm really looking forward to getting into this conversation. Not because it's a happy conversation, but again, because it is a very necessary conversation with all sorts of implications across a number of different fronts. Before we get into this conversation with Dr. Josh Weiss, I do want to just give our gratitude to our friends at the Accord Network. Check the link in our show notes. If you are involved in relief and development work, Accord Network is a great spot to check out, including for the upcoming conference later this year. Dr. Josh Weiss, thank you so much for being on Think Global Do Justice. I really appreciate you taking some time this morning.
You are very welcome, Brandon. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. I heard you recently on another show and just really appreciated your framework and just kind of your understanding around conflicts in general and how to reach a peace agreement, and just your insight on this in particular. Maybe we could start, Dr. Weiss, if you just share a little bit of your background in negotiation, in this diplomatic space that you're in.
Sure. So, well, there's kind of three buckets of things that I do, I guess, if I could put it that way. The first is that I run a project with William Ury, who's a well-known negotiation expert and co-author of Getting to Yes, a very well-known negotiation book, called the Global Negotiation Initiative. And so we do some work at the international realm in particular, with our focus there. So that's the first thing that we engage with. The second is that I have my own consulting company, so I do a lot of work with governments, with for-profit, nonprofit, you name it. There's lots of negotiation and conflict to go around, so I'm pretty busy on that front, and there's probably very few industries I haven't worked with. When human beings exist, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be negotiation, there's going to be leadership challenges. So I work with lots of folks to do training, but also coaching and advising and getting involved in, real world stuff, et cetera, mediations and things along those lines. And then the third thing is that I run a master's program at a smaller university in Western Massachusetts called Bay Path University. And an entirely online master's program in organizational leadership and negotiation. Over the years, I've worked on a number of different conflicts, in particular doing a lot of what's called back channel work or track two work, bringing parties together informally out of the limelight to try to infuse creative and interesting ideas into the formal processes or to help funnel those ideas into decision makers' hands. A lot of times, decision makers are bound by, the official governmental processes. And so it's hard to think a little creatively in those processes. So we try to support that and supplement it with some quieter diplomacy and things along those lines.
Would you say that back channeling is pretty much always there? Like you hear that, but to someone like me who's just listening to, New York Times or AP or whatever, like I don't necessarily even know what that means, but from what you're describing, is that just pretty much always a factor in negotiations?
It is now, and I think that throughout history there absolutely have been a lot of different back channels that have been important. For example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis and things along those lines, very important, and many modern day peace processes, absolutely. So yes, it is. It's not the kind of thing that gets talked a lot about. The whole point of it is to try to keep it quiet and to try to be able to apply creative thinking and different ways of coming at a problem, to then, like I said, share those ideas. But yes, it's a pretty common mainstay, and it is also a pretty unknown dimension to diplomacy and negotiation.
Yeah. When we talk about negotiation, especially on the international relations front,
Yeah.
what are some fundamental elements, some fundamental considerations for any negotiation? Like these pieces should kind of be in place. Can you just kind of help us kind of understand the world in general, just basic elements?
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, to begin, I think a lot of that has changed in the last year or two. I think the Trump administration's approach to diplomacy is very, very different than what we've seen in the past. Even a little more different than his first administration. It feels as if international law is not really relevant anymore. And that's sad. I don't mean to say it's not relevant, but what I do mean is that there's no overarching body. There never really has been. People look to the United Nations, but the United Nations is a compilation of states. It's not. It's not its own entity. The Security Council members are the ones that control what happens and what doesn't, and they have veto power over everything. So from an international perspective, there were norms that we all followed for a very long time, particularly post World War II. And those norms seem to have changed quite a bit. And there's less and less of a focus, particularly on the part of the United States and other actors, to really hone in on international law and to kind of just do what it is that nation states need to do in order to protect themselves as they would frame it. Right? So, but from a negotiation point of view, like I said, there is the official channels and then there's the back channel kind of work. There's also a lot of alliance building and coalition building. And I think this is something that's quite important. I think what you've seen, for example, with the Trump administration now, the way in which they came in with full bluster and tariffs and threats of invasion and things along those lines, are now having a consequence, right? Trump reached out to people and said, hey, NATO allies, we need you to get involved in what's going on in Iran. And they said, no, thank you. And that's because he doesn't fully understand how you use alliances and coalitions and things along those lines. It's not a one-way street. People are going to do what's in their best interest. And if you're treating them less than as allies, then the response that we've seen is pretty obvious, I guess is the best word I can use. That if I'm a country that's being threatened in that way, it's the last thing I'm going to do. And look, this conflict, which has sat for the close to 50 years, there's a reason why people have not done this thus far. It is complicated, it is difficult, it is far-reaching, and there is not a military solution to this, in my estimation. There's a way in which the military dimension to this is having a significant impact, but in the end, there has to be some kind of solution at the negotiation table. That's the lesson over, since World War II, is that these conflicts get dealt with at the negotiating table. The question is, how long are people going to fight before they come to the table? And that is the $64,000 question that we're always confronted with. And it comes down to, how do countries assess their interests, their what's important to them, et cetera, at that moment in time?
You bring up a couple interesting things. One, on the international law front, we recently had a conversation with Dr. Greg Birch and a former ambassador from Venezuela, Alejandro Ubieda. And this came up as well. Now, the result of the Venezuelan conflict was Maduro was removed. Many Venezuelans were happy about that. He was not a good person, right? And yet it was kind of this do the ends justify the means kind of thing, because again, there you also see a jumping straight to what was potentially in the U.S. interest, but doing it in a way that just kind of completely, did away with international law, right?
Yeah.
Now, when you describe kind of this seismic shift in terms of the last couple of years, just in terms of international diplomacy and so forth, do you think that this is a blip on the radar, or do you think that this is something that might be more like, even after Trump's current administration, who knows, maybe it goes back to a Democrat, maybe it goes to one of his lesser whatever, Rubio or whoever, right?
Yeah.
Vance. Do you think that this is something that's going to be like, it's not going to be go back to anything like it used to be in the 80s, 90s, so forth?
Well, I mean, it's always possible, that we'll shift back in that direction. I think part of it depends on the tone that's set by the next administration, if that's how this plays out. I think that there's, history, in my estimation, is sort of pendulum swings, right? That we had a liberal democratic order that was in place for quite a long time, since World War II, and we are now swinging very far in the other direction. How far back it will come, I don't know. Um, some of that, of course, comes down to the next person in charge and how they try to deal with all of this. I will say that alliances and other kinds of coalitions that have been central to U.S. foreign policy for a very long time have been badly damaged, and it's going to take a long time and a lot of commitment on the part of the United States to rebuild those if they ever get rebuilt. Um, it is hard. If I'm an ally of the United States, it's very hard to, sort of see consistency. It's very hard to see, hey, are they going to be there for me if I need them, like they're asking me to be there for them? And so my sense is it's not a blip per se. I think that there's a way to move the needle back in the other direction, but it's going to obviously depend greatly on who that next person is and if that's what they're going to prioritize when it comes to foreign policy. I, I, I'm pretty sure if it's a Democrat, they will. Um, if it's a Republican, it really depends. It depends on who it is. If it was a Rubio, maybe. If it's a Vance, I doubt it. I think it becomes less of a blip and more of the norm. But the thing that I think is also important for your listeners to understand is that the damage that's been done is significant, and it will take a long time to repair if we ever get back there. I remember when I first started traveling overseas, my first job I ever had was actually as an election monitor in Bosnia after the war, and then I did more work between the communities there. And people absolutely, loved the United States. They loved what we stood for and believed that we were sort of a beacon of hope in a world that was chaotic. And, there was a moral authority, there was a moral power that we held. And we've held that for a long time. And I think it's very fair to say that that's gone. Um, that, if you look at polling, it's fascinating that people around the world are seeing the United States as the biggest threat
Hmm.
nowadays to the world order and not other places like Russia and China and things like that. And that's very telling.
Hmm.
It really is, and one of the things that we learn a lot about and we talk a lot about when it comes to international relations is power. And how you wield your power matters,
Hmm.
and we are wielding it to its fullest effect without really thinking about the consequences of doing that. And having worked in lots of conflicts and worked with a lot of parties to negotiation, when you wield power in a manner that is unbridled, if I can put it that way,
Hmm.
right? There's always a consequence. And sadly, that consequence comes back around slowly but surely. And I think, in part, even with this war, I think we're seeing that our allies are not there for us.
Yeah.
And if anybody was really surprised by that, I don't know what you're looking at,
Right.
because you shouldn't be. Because when you treat people in that way, like, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. Would that be a long-term concern of yours? So if we look at some of the recent Middle East, some people
Hmm.
say 9/11 was the result of the first Gulf War, George H.W. Bush's. You look at ISIS and say, well, that was a result of the Iraq War. And now, and those are, I mean, again, just atrocious tragedies. So when you talk about, like, comes back around, or those types of things, are you concerned that this could have a long-term effect in terms of some unforeseen consequence by what the U.S. and Israel is currently doing in Iran?
Well, I think it would be naive to think that there aren't going to be consequences to all of this. Like when you're, if you decide to attack another country, you have to imagine that there's going to be that. The question is, what does that look like? And I think it's hard to pull these things out piecemeal. There's a flow of history that exists that we experience. And I think, as you say, I mean, there were these punctuated events that create these different entities. I think part of what that's pointing to in my mind is more important, which is that these conflicts are not simple at all. They are filled with gray. They are not black and white. And so, thinking that you can, bomb a regime into submission and get a different regime that's more friendly to the United States or others, like it doesn't really work that way. And even if it did work that way, okay, if we take the Iranian example, about 20% support the current regime or the Ayatollah, the previous Ayatollah, which means there's a lot of people that don't. But what it also means is that if you were to, have this kind of a campaign, and let's say you deposed the leadership and installed somebody else, it means you have 20% of 90 million people who are going to be out there actively continuing um, some form of resistance, right? And that's what ISIS was, and that's what Al Qaeda was, and that's what all of these things were. So we have to be really careful of thinking that this is going to solve the problem. The only way that I know that you solve these kinds of problems is at the table, and that's what makes it so hard. Is that it's difficult. You don't sit down with your friends when you're in wars. You sit down with your enemies. That's why negotiation is so difficult, but also so important.
Yeah.
But you have to create a lasting solution. You have to create something in the end that people say, okay, like we can live with this, like we can, see a future here for us and our children and things along those lines, just like you can. And, like sometimes people don't want to hear that, but that's the reality. And, the interesting thing is people say, oh, but diplomacy, it never really works and blah, blah. And I'm like, well, okay, I think you're wrong if that's what your perspective is. Because if you look around the world, we've had, transitions in Northern Ireland and South Africa and Colombia and Mozambique and El Salvador. And the list goes on of conflicts that have been solved. They're not perfect, by the way, and they're not going to be perfect. And I think that's important for people to understand that when you sign a peace agreement, that's the beginning of the end. It's not the end. The hard work is implementing that. And, when societies have gone through traumatic experiences like what's happening, it takes a long time to create a normal, healthy, functioning society. And so one of the problems is that we live in a world where everybody expects things like this, right? And that's not how this works. It takes time. People in South Africa are still saying, hey, like there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of problem. And I'm like, you're right. Like there are a lot of things that are still problematic and a result of literally centuries of conflict. And so if you think that that's just going to go away overnight, like you're not being realistic about it. Like we have
Hmm.
to go into these things clear-eyed, facing the cold hard facts about what it's going to take to change a society from where they were to where, people might hope that they would be and to welcome them into the family of nations kind of
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting. And, thinking about coming to an agreement, there was the JCPOA that was in place. So much of the talks of why this is necessary, whether it be war or whether it be diplomacy, is to keep Iran from developing nuclear armory, right? So obviously, the JCPOA was struck under President Obama, and Trump was not interested in that. What were the pros and cons? Because I guess you can say from an American perspective. Okay, so what were the pros and cons of the JCPOA? And yeah, just kind of give us a little bit, even just kind of history, because there were other things in place that didn't involve U.S. and Israeli missiles going into Iran and Iran, attacking the Gulf states, attacking Israel, etc.
Sure. Right. Well, so I mean, I think the two primary benefits of the JCPO. First of all, I mean, I think there was a psychological benefit to it, right? That people didn't think it would be possible to reach an agreement with Iran over their nuclear programs and capability. So I think there's a psychological dimension there that was important, right? And I think one of the things that Obama did that I respected greatly was he really tried to give diplomacy the utmost opportunity to succeed. He understood how problematic wars are and how how much pain and essentially setting up the next round of conflict usually happens from that. So after that, I would say that the agreement itself, I think, did two things well. One is it really slowed the Iranians down dramatically. There was a real clear sense that if they were going to be pursuing nuclear capability, it was going to be over quite a long period of time, like maybe 30 years. And there was a decent amount of verification that was involved. And I think that's the other part of it that was strong, was that there were solid verification measures. Now, did the Iranians follow all of that? No. Did they follow a lot of it? Yes, they did, actually. And they were actually living up to a good bit of the agreement that was on paper. I think the two downsides, if I can put it that way, are that it didn't do away with their program, right? It tried to put it on a track where, perhaps it would transition to a program for more peaceful purposes. Um, but I think the biggest concern, and I don't know, I wouldn't call it necessarily a flaw, but a challenge with the agreement was that it didn't seek to be more comprehensive. It didn't seek to try to rein in Iran's activities with their proxies. And I think that's the biggest challenge that agreement had. It's interesting because that was one of the biggest critiques by the Trump administration of the JCPOA, and yet it does not appear as if during their own talks leading up in January and February leading up to the war, that they were actually able to also make progress on the proxies and things like that. The Iranians were unwilling to make that part of the negotiation process. Might they have done it at some point? I don't know, but the same parameters were in place that they wanted to talk about the nuclear program and things along those lines, and they weren't going to weave in questions about their proxies and things that were broader in scope.
Yeah. And one of the things that I appreciate you discussing is, look, there's always going to be compromises. And I know that might be a hard word for some people in this space. But if there's no interest for one party to get something in return, then what's their interest in even being a part of such a deal in the first place, right?
Well, right. And I think that's, one of the fundamental notions about negotiation that I think people often miss is that usually both sides need to declare victory. They need to say, look what I got. Here's what I got, right, as a result of doing this. Because, if I can't do that, then why would I say yes, right? And so it has to be that kind of dynamic, and yet too often people aren't thinking that. They're thinking that I'm going to win and they're going to lose. And I can tell you this much, especially when it comes to international relations, countries that perceive themselves to have lost don't forget it. I mean, World War I set up World War II because of the humiliation that the Germans felt. Now, rightly or wrongly, right? That's not the point. The point is when we have a winner and a loser, that's usually what happens, is that there's a festering. It's the same notion, by the way, with Russia today and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin was obsessed with the notion of resurrecting the Russian Empire because it was humiliated in his eyes. And so, again, we see this cycle that happens constantly. in conflicts where if one side feels like they've lost face or embarrassed or were defeated, most people don't handle that well, and it sets up the next round of problems.
Yeah. One of the things that I think about that appears to be a barrier in certain ways is these two specific parties. Okay. So, on the one hand, you have, these peace talks appear to be inhibited because the two actors are one, a businessman turned president who doesn't look for compromise, is a bit domineering. And then now I don't know Iran very well. I've had an Iranian on the podcast last year, and that was insightful. But, you know, at least part of the narrative, you can speak to this in your own view, but part of the view is Iranian leadership almost has like a theology of suffering in a way, like from like a religious element.
Mm.
And they're also not afraid to oppress their own people. So this seems like this is not a good combination here in terms of like the people that you're trying to get to the table. What would you say to that, Dr. Weiss?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult dynamic to think about what we just discussed, right? Which is how are both sides going to declare victory? I do think Trump and his administration are all about wanting to do that and demonstrating to the world that they won, whatever that means, right? And I think that the Iranians, there is a strong dimension there as well of preserving their face as part of these negotiations and things like that. And as you say, the theocratic approach also limits you, right? It limits your ability to think differently and creatively with certain principles. So I think it's a really important dimension, and I think it's going to make it harder for each side to do that. And I also believe that there's another big problem that is part of these negotiations, which is I'm not convinced the United States speaks for their quote unquote allies in this scenario. I believe that the United States and Israel's objectives are a bit different. I think the United States would be probably satisfied by saying we crippled their capability, the nuclear capability and other weaponry, and we're going to declare victory and go home. And I think the Israelis are more focused on regime change and trying to topple the regime. And then, so even if the United States and Iran were to reach an agreement, there's this question about what Israel does. Does Trump have enough sway over Netanyahu to get him to go along with it? Right now, this morning, there's a conversation about a 45-day ceasefire. Um, the challenge with that is that in the past, right, if you look at, say, with Israel and Gaza or whatever it might be, these ceasefires don't seem to mean a lot. Like people are agreeing to them and then, you know, we're back to the bombing shortly thereafter. So that's one dimension. I think the other dimension too is the Gulf states. That the Gulf states are the ones, Israel and the Gulf states are the ones that are being targeted by Iran because that's what their capability is able to deal with. But I think the Gulf states also have different interests here as well, and they're not at the table. So it becomes a question, when parties aren't at the table that probably ought to be there, you run into a challenge, right? Which is that if you agree to something, the question is, well, okay, is everybody coming along, or how is that going to work going forward? And I think that is a really big challenge to these negotiations. It doesn't mean it's not possible, and there has been more and more activity. I mean, look, this is the kind of conflict that's global in scope, despite who the parties are, right? The Strait of Hormuz and oil, fertilizer, lots of things are getting impacted by this war. And
Yeah.
so, when you see Pakistan, when you see Egypt, when you see Turkey, when you see Saudi Arabia, trying to play a constructive role, that, by the way, to me is a positive,
Yeah.
um, because we have not seen a Pakistan, for example, We've seen Turkey and Egypt maybe doing this a little bit more, but we definitely haven't seen Pakistan stepping in that way. And it's also interesting to note, the role of Saudi Arabia here, and their willingness to be part of a process. They've sent some interesting and what I would consider mixed signals about what they want out of all of this, because MBS, about 10 days ago told Trump, keep fighting until you finish the job, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of people in the region that are very worried that the United States will declare victory and go home with a very broken Iranian regime that makes it dangerous to continue, right? So I think from a negotiation point of view, you can't just look at Iran and the United States and say, well, is a deal possible? A deal's possible for sure. But the question is, are other parties going to live up to that? What happens to these others that have, in my estimation, different interests here?
Hmm.
And is the Trump administration willing, and do they have the ability to push them? I think it might be fair to say that the Israelis might look at this and say, Iran is crippled, Hamas is very crippled, Hezbollah is, struggling mightily.
Hmm.
And so they might think, well, we don't really need the United States anymore in the way we needed them at the beginning of this war. We can forge ahead and continue on and things like that. I don't know what their calculation is, and I don't know if anybody does, but those kinds of factors are elements to this that are important and are going to have an impact on what ultimately happens here.
Wouldn't you say that Israel's military capacity is always dependent on the U.S.? I mean, isn't it something like $4 billion just as a baseline investment in them every year, and so much of their military weaponry and so forth? I mean, it is interesting because that's kind of one of the big questions coming into the Iran war is um, because there were talks beforehand and everything you saw in the news was like, okay, they're making progress, and then boom, you wake up, it's February 28th, and
Right.
and
Yep.
and the Ayatollah is dead. Like so in terms of that U.S. Israeli peace to this whole thing.
Hmm.
We could speculate if it was just kind of like, no, Netanyahu was coming over to the U.S. 7 times in the last year or something like that, and they were going to do this regardless, or if Netanyahu led Trump, or I don't know. There's a lot of speculation there, but I'm just kind of like, it's interesting to hear you say that even if the U.S. struck a deal, if Israel is more ambitious, that they could potentially just continue on if Iran is as weakened as they could potentially be. That's interesting.
I think it comes down to that. I mean, there's no question that Israel has been heavily reliant on U.S. military support, etc., and they likely will be in the future. But I think Netanyahu, since he came into power, has had this war in mind,
Hmm.
and saw Iran as an existential threat to Israel.
Hmm.
And so um, it's not that they would ignore the United States. It's more that if they genuinely feel like we are not safe, I'll use that language, right? If we're not safe as long as this regime is in power, they may say, look, if the United States is not willing to go with us, we may forge ahead anyways because we
Hmm.
don't believe the job is done
Yeah.
in that regard. That's really what I mean more, and I think it's because Iran has certainly been weakened. The question of how much is we don't really know. There was the notion that Trump had said that the U.S. has complete and full air superiority, and then jets were shot down.
Right.
So not right. So we
Right.
don't know what to believe, and there's the notion of the fog of war is always impacting decisions, where we don't really know what's true,
Hmm.
and we have people, to be very frank, on both sides who are loose with the truth.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so it's very hard to know like what the reality is on the ground, and how far or how close you are to certain realities.
Hmm.
But I think more to the point, when it comes to Israel, like I think they may well look at this and say, Iran will never be this weak again. If we don't keep going, like, you know, we're not going to achieve our objective.
They might
So
think it's time to go for the jugular is potentially their rationale.
potentially, right. And you know, when you're also having that kind of a moment, there is, you know, the impetus for negotiation, right? Like Iran might look at this and say, okay, you know we can do this for a while. We know we can do these strikes and attacks and things like that, but we can't do it forever. And
Hmm.
so we're going to have to find another solution here. And it may be, you know, again, with the Trump administration finding a ceasefire that might lead to a longer term scenario. It's hard because the rhetoric is also not helping, right?
Yeah.
Bombing people back to the Stone Age and things
Right.
like
Yeah.
that, and then claims that they're talking and then they're not talking. And, you know, like I said, there's a lot of fog in this war. There's usually a lot. Um, but I think in this particular case, because you have people on each side who like to use a lot of hyperbole and strong language, you know, that never makes negotiation easy. It's hard to negotiate with the notion of we're going to bomb you back to the Stone Age, right? But there is also the notion that, you know, with that comes pressure to stay at the table. I mean, that can be a positive, which is that it sort of encourages people to say, look, you know, we're not going to get to some kind of full and utter defeat here. So our next best sort of scenario is to come up with some negotiated agreement
Yeah.
that is going to give each side the ability to say, A, on the Iranian side, we're still here, we're still, you know, surviving, doing our thing, etc. And on the United States side, that declaration of victory.
Yeah, you know, it's when you look at some of the maps of this war, you see obviously Iran right there in the center, and there's strikes that are going out regionally, but really
Hmm.
it seems like the place that the U.S. might be getting hit the worst is actually economically, and that's why you hear so much of the Strait of Hormuz. And I'll just kind of read. You've already referred to a couple of these. You know, when a head of state says something publicly, it is essentially policy in a unique way. It may not be like, you know, a ratified document from the government necessarily, but it says something that's important. And there
Mm.
have been some public statements on, especially on Truth Social, directly from President Trump. And we've already referred to a couple of these. He had put out on April 1st, Iran's new regime president, much less radicalized and far more intelligent than his predecessors, and has just asked the United States of America for a ceasefire. We will consider when Hormuz Strait is open, free, and clear. Until then, we are blasting Iran into oblivion, or as they say, back to the Stone Age. Okay, so these are some of the statements. There was another one just a couple days ago that a lot of people are running with right now. And
Mhm.
it does bring into, we already saw early on in the war, the missile that hit the school of Iranian children, which is just tragic and terrible. And attacking infrastructure is, to put it lightly, generally frowned upon.
Mhm.
And this was, we are recording on Monday, April 6th, and this will release on Tuesday, April 7th. According to President Trump, Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the effing straight, you crazy. Boy, I'm not, as a Christian podcast, I'm not used to getting an E on my on my thing, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah, President Donald J. Trump. Um, this is very. You mentioned rhetoric. I mean, this is extreme. It's not anything that we're not used to seeing necessarily from the president, but these are people's lives. And again, you kind of see the focus on the Strait of Hormuz. Um, Speak to us a little bit just in terms of like some of one the rhetoric, but then also um, these downstream effects, the economic ramifications. Right, that's where we feel it. I live in Washington State. It's expensive enough to drive my car, anyways. But talk to us a little bit. How do those things also get wrapped up and considered within negotiations. A lot has been focused on the economic piece.
Well, yeah, well, and I do think the economic piece of it is where the pressure is coming from for Trump. To be honest, the military dimensions to this, are important. They're symbolic. They're not, they haven't been catastrophic in that way. And I'm not trying to downplay that at all. I'm just saying that I think whatever pressure President Trump is feeling, it's because of the economics, because of the domestic dimensions of this. And I also would say it's also because, you know, the United States did not build a massive coalition to go about this. And so the more of the burden the United States has to bear, the more he's, pushing on allies and others to get involved. Look, at some point, the British and the French and others might get involved, but it's not because they're feeling some empathy toward us. It would be for their own purposes. It would be for the oil and other products that are important that make their way through the Strait of Hormuz. So, like, that is an important factor in negotiation. We always talk about where are the sources of leverage, where are the sources of power in a given situation, and I think the place where Trump is vulnerable. First of all, I mean, I think it's on the economic side of things, but I also think that he didn't consult most people, and so when people don't feel like they're part of the process. Lyndon Johnson once said, "If I'm not in on the liftoff, don't expect me to be in on the landing." And I think there's a lot of people who are very critical of him and his administration for not, going to Congress and not doing the kinds of consultation and coalition building that one would think would be important here in this kind of a situation. And again, we have avoided as a world for 50 years a military confrontation here for good reason. It's complicated, it's challenging, it's problematic, and there is no easy solution. And I think that is part of the problem, which is, people who are experts in regime change and things like that essentially have said it's almost impossible to change a regime just through bombing and things like that. And, take it one step further. The deployment of more U.S. military to the region is a problem. And I think there are a lot of people who are really, I mean, there's a lot of people in this country who are opposed to this war. But if you start putting boots on the ground, it's a whole nother ball game. And I think there are a lot of people, and even in the MAGA world who, first of all, Trump ran on not doing this. And I think that you are beginning to see some real fractures within MAGA because, they want it to be America first. And this is not America first. This is America, again, in what could easily be an endless war in the Middle East where young American men and women are dying and asking what's the objective, what's the clear way that you solve this problem. Those kinds of things in my mind, have not been answered and they're complicated. There's a great quote by Nietzsche who said, for every complicated problem, there's a clear and simple solution that's wrong. And, I'm a big believer that that's often what happens with these things is people take actions, they try to use a simple, blunt tool to handle a complicated problem, and it doesn't work. And I
Yeah.
can point to many other instances of that, like building a giant wall to deal with immigration, right? I mean, it's just things along those lines that it sounds good, I guess. It sounds simple, people can understand it, and then yet, what kind of efficacy does it really have? Does it really solve the problem, or or are you going to put in the time that's necessary to get at really what's going on here and how do you create a lasting solution? I think that's the folks that I spend a lot of time with, that's the big question is not can you do a lot of damage militarily and things like that. More, what's the lasting solution that we're talking about here?
Yeah.
And I don't know if anybody really has a clear idea of what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very complicated. There, I not, I did not support President Trump. I've never voted for him, nor would I ever even consider it, to be honest. But one of the few things I did like was the
Hmm.
non-interventionist. Every person's going to have certain things that you agree with, right? Some more than others, obviously, but that was one that I was actually like, okay, well, at least there's that, but apparently not.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Dr. Weiss, you mentioned, just in terms of the complicated nature of this.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've been talking the conflict at large, but then also specifically focusing on negotiation. As we prepare to wrap up our conversation,
Hmm.
if you were back channeling or if you were involved in some way, what would be some elements that you think there could be compromise on that could bring an end to this conflict altogether? Not just in I guess maybe lump U.S. and Israel together because, like you said, they might have some differing objectives and ambitions. But what would be some things that like you got to have this, you got to have that? Iran's going to have to compromise here. U.S. is going to compromise there.
Well, to be very honest with you, like if I was involved in this, what I would actually be trying to do is I would be trying to talk to these other players and to understand where their lines are. Because I think that one, look, in the end, whatever the end is, there will be a different Middle East. Okay, right. We don't know what I don't know what that means exactly. I don't think, I don't think anybody does. And, trying to predict that is foolhardy. I've learned that much having worked in the region for the better part of 20 years. Like, you cannot predict what's going to happen there. But I think your best chance for actually coming up with a sustainable solution is really to broaden the scope of what's going on here and bring in regional players, bring in Saudi Arabia. Not the Gulf states are important from a psychological point of view, but like big major players in this need to be brought into the mix. And if you can move, sometimes one way to approach a negotiation is to move from just the two primary parties here that seem to be engaging and broaden the scope and say, let's come up with a regional solution to this, where perhaps we weave in the notion of a path to a Palestinian state as part of this conversation, right? We come up with a economic pact amongst regional players, and perhaps even a security pact that people can get on board with. I think what you want to do in a scenario like this is those other players are going to be part of the future, right? So bring them in now and start to talk about what if we were to do more of a grand bargain here that would really reshape the Middle East. And to be honest, like I think that's the kind of thing that the Trump administration would, if they could turn around and say, look what we did, from a regional point of view, we've changed the dynamic and things like that. Like that might be attractive to them. And I think if Iran can hold on to some of their capabilities and be brought in out of the cold, to have their sanctions fully dropped, to maybe shift to more of a nuclear energy kind of program, and create economic incentives and things like that. And by the way, all of that doesn't take away, the worldviews that are also part of this. But I think that way of thinking and doing may have a better chance of actually getting you somewhere sustainable. And I think that means, to your point about what are the countries going to have to really think about, it very likely means that the United States is going to have to think of economic incentives and scaling back their own role in the region, as part of this. And then on the flip side, I think the Iranians would have to curb their support of these proxies. I mean, honestly, a lot of that is sort of happening through the military piece. But I think we also, you always have to prepare yourself for the notion that there will be spoilers along the way, people who aren't happy with any kind of negotiated solution. And your goal can never be to get 100% of the people behind these kinds of things. What you're aiming for is 70 to 75%. So it's, two-thirds of the country who say, this is our new future, this is our new way. And, if you can tap into that kind of thing, that there's an Iranian population that in many ways is also predisposed to that they are interested, and maybe more than anywhere else in the region, save Israel, interested in more freedom and more democracy oriented things. I'm not saying they're going to become a democracy, because I don't think that's the way that this plays out. But I do think freedoms and other kinds of things are important to the Iranian population. And so you could imagine a solution. And the nice thing about doing that is that you broaden the scope and you start to say, well, what are the pieces of the puzzle that we can bring in here that maybe otherwise, the Saudis are more than capable of bringing a lot of economic aspects of, things as incentives to get on a different track.
Yeah, that's really, I appreciate the kind of more expansive view of it, because if we were to just isolate just ending this conflict and not understanding that we actually already will have a different environment, we need to address all of those different aspects across multiple countries. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So I really appreciate that. Dr. Weiss, I'm so appreciative of your time this morning and your insight. I'm learning from you in this, and I know our listeners will as well. So thank you so much for joining the podcast.
You're most welcome. Thanks so much for having me on, Brandon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And for our listeners, may Almighty God, who created us in his own image, grant us grace to fearlessly contend against evil and to make no peace with oppression, that we may reverently use our freedom and employ it in the maintenance of justice in our communities and among the nations, to the glory of God's holy name, through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. And we will catch you guys on the next episode of Think Global, Do Justice.